Hey, my name is Anton. Today I'm going to show you how I made this scene in Unreal Engine 5 using Blender. So this tutorial is going to be an intermediate one, so you have to know your way around Blender and Unreal Engine 5 to kinda understand what's going on the screen. But with that being said, even if you're just a beginner, I think some parts of this video are going to be very beneficial for you. So give it a look. Some parts of this tutorial are going to be step by step, while others are going to be a time lapse with commentary. And my goal for this tutorial is not going to be to only show you how I model things, but also share with you my thought process. I want to show you how a complex thing like that is made, and I want to show you that nothing is going to look good from the very beginning, and only through many iterations you can get something that is beautiful. This video is going to be divided into 4 parts. First one is composition, second one is modeling Megabuilding 1, third one is creating hero building, and the fourth one is creating this matrix-like code hologram. And topics that I have not covered in this video are going to be covered in the next ones, because this one is already getting pretty long. Alright, let's start. I will give you a brief overview of the composition. Here is a time lapse of me iterating over it. The composition has changed drastically over the course of the project, but the main foreground elements stay. These are character and motorcycle. I did not base the composition on any concepts, I just went straight to 3D. You will see me moving things around quite a lot. Also be warned that the compositional part of this video is mostly time-lapse, so expect to see a lot of flashing images, simply because things will move pretty quick. Now why do you start with the Japanese temple instead of blocking a scene out? Well, simply because my initial plan was quite a different scene, and it was something smaller. At first I wanted it to be a motorcycle and perhaps a character in front of a Japanese temple, and in the background I wanted to put some scenery, some trees, some buildings, and perhaps a river. So what I'm placing now are supposed to be river canal and buildings. At this stage things are quite fluid and I tend to move around blockouts quite a lot. I also move the sun and see what kind of shadow patterns I get. The red thing in the foreground is supposed to be a motorcycle, even though it doesn't look like it now. And you can also see me making some kind of a tunnel that is leading to the motorcycle. My initial plan was to maybe create a tunnel through which a camera would fly and then zoom in on the motorcycle. And that would be my composition. But throughout working on the scene I came up with better ideas. I think it's important to not get locked into the ideas that do not work, even though you like these ideas. And it's a good practice to throw out things that do not work 100%. What I'm doing now is I have selected and exported some of the blockout elements from Unreal into Blender. This is something that I do quite a lot. I place rough shapes in the engine and then refine them with my 3D package. But I find it necessary to go through the blockout stage in Unreal, because that way you can see how things are going to react to lighting. Here I am deforming an array of modules with a spline tool. Spline tools are very useful in Blender and very powerful too, although they can be a little annoying, especially when you are dealing with arrays and points of origin. Here's a quick demonstration if you do not know how to do that. We will create a cube and we will delete 2 of its sides. Then we will center the cube, put its origin to the world's center. And create a curve. We will orient it. Also take the origin of the spline tool and put it to its begin, and then put it to the world's origin as well. Now select the cube and apply array modifier. Put the factor to 1 and in the y direction. Up the count to 7. Don't forget to merge, to select the merge option, because that would merge the vertices on the edge of the cube. And select our Bezier curve. That's it. You're done. Just select the Bezier curve and you're free to deform it. So yeah, very easy. Now let's get back to the time lapse. At this point, my intention is still to keep the temple as one of the central elements. The idea was also originally to put some flower pots on top of the temple's roof, but I ultimately rejected that idea. This was planned as some benches with trees leading to the temple. That was also something that I would ultimately throw away, as something that was not working composition-wise. Another idea of mine was to create this canal and surround it with sakura trees. This kind of composition didn't work out simply because from that point of view you couldn't make out sakura trees or the canal. Placing the first mega building here. And to be honest, this kind of composition is not bad at all. But I felt like I wanted to do something else. I wanted to have some framing for the giant holograms in my scene. And this kind of composition wouldn't allow for it. So this is a very early stage of composing the image. And here I am thinking in terms of whether I should create this kind of sweeping line with the background buildings. Refining the shape of the overpass here for this stage of the composition. If you ever think that you are struggling with the compositional stage of your scene, I would suggest not to worry all that much. Because everyone is struggling, I am struggling with it as well. It does take me many iterations to get the composition right. Sometimes it can be days or weeks even for me to nail the composition. And even then, sometimes I'm not completely content with what I get. So give yourself some slack, because this is just a hard thing to do, really. And throughout my work on the scene, I would get some cool ideas, or at least I thought they were cool, but you never know until you try them out. Like what I'm doing now. This is a platform for flying vehicles. I thought maybe I would create a platform on which a flying vehicle would land, but this also didn't work out, because compositionally it was in the wrong place. As you can see, I'm also experimenting a bit with different times of day, and I also added some new elements to the scene. At this point, I'm already beginning to think that, oh well, this kind of composition is not working out at all. And even though I have created quite a lot of assets here already, still not locked into that composition that I have selected. Yeah, this is the time to change it completely. I could afford to do that because the assets would fit into the new composition and I would simply need to move things around to make it work. So I created a new plan. This is the very rough overpaint. The motorcycle and the character, they stay at the same place. They remain in the center of the foreground. But I would also place a main building in the center of the middle ground. And I would also let the composition point at the character in the foreground. At the same time, objects on the left and right would frame the center of the image. So here's that central building, just a blockout for now. In the end, I'm going to split it into two symmetrical halves, but for now it's just a blockout. I'm experimenting with its placement and its size, and avoid things like top of the building being cut off by the frame. And it's funny because I'm going to do this quite a lot, but you don't have to repeat my mistakes. Be sure to let your elements in the scene breathe a little bit, give them some space, if that's needed. There should be a nice contrast of detail and less detail. Experiment with negative space. By this point, I made up my mind that my scene is going to be symmetrical. And I thought that would frame the main building in quite a pleasant way. As you can see, that overpass is still there, which is going to have a different shape and a different placement. Like this. It's also going to become some kind of framing for the main building. And this overpass also has another utility, because it's going to hide whatever is on the ground from the viewer, and that would mean less work for me, because then I don't have to model anything on the ground. So finally I get to the point where I split the main building here, and I also placed a monument in front of the character. This monument is going to point to the character and the motorcycle. And here I'm just experimenting with the shapes, with the elements of the building, to see how it's going to react to light and shadow. You will see me now getting close to the final lighting. I also created some background buildings with which I could play around. But I also wasn't really happy with the composition, so I decided to make another overpaint. The idea here was to create some kind of an oval shape to frame the character and the lily flower, the hologram. So the central building is going to fulfill this purpose, as well as the monument. You will see me going through a lot of iterations for the wings. Ultimately, I decided to go with the simplest shape, because having multiple wings made the scene kinda noisy. These are pretty much all of the important landmarks of the compositional stage. Let's stop here with the time-lapse and analyze the final image. So here you can see that I have these framing elements to the left and to the right. Also, creating those side elements had another purpose. They block off a lot of space, and that means I don't have to detail the space behind them all that much. As you can see here, the glowing LED lights inside the monument, they point to the character, and especially so in motion. Big screens on both sides, they kinda balance the whole thing out. Also, they help out lighting wise because the one on the left gives off a very warm color and the one on the right gives off a cold color. I also felt like there was something missing compositionally from the image without these holographic pillars. So I put them there and I think it's a nice touch. As you can see, I also put a concrete fence over there in the background. This line of concrete fence is nicely broken up by these sakura trees. This makes it so that there is no wall of concrete there, because that would be quite jarring. Back in Unreal Engine, we can see that I am using fog sheets to kinda separate background from foreground elements. And that is it for the compositional side of things. We will begin by creating one of the modules for the future building. It will be just a quarter of a single floor. You can see me right now setting up an array of floors. I established from the very beginning that the height of each floor is going to be 5 meters. And since I don't need to model every side, I will just keep a quarter and the rest will be mirrored. You will see me going back to the reference image from Cyberpunk a lot. And don't worry, we are not going to go over every building in detail, just this one. Other buildings are created in the same manner, so I don't think it's going to be necessary to go over creation of every single one of them. I'm looking for the right shape of the building, and I would say this part of the job takes me the most time. Now I will collapse my stack of modifiers. The building consists of 3 similar parts. And now I am adding the end part of it. Okay, so here is a rough shape of a single module, and I also put an array on it. And here is creation of the outer part of the building, which is going to be this metal facade, but first we have to find its shape. And solidify modifier is going to save me a lot of time here. Okay, rough shapes of the framework are in place. The reference image has these circular holes in the facades, so we're going to boolean them out. And you can also put an array on your booleans. Don't forget that you can stack array modifiers too. Okay, now we have a new issue. We need to remove some of these cylinder shapes from the boolean. So I did that in the most quick and dirty way. I simply collapsed my modifier stack and selected and deleted the unneeded shapes. But yeah, I collapsed the modifier stack and then added solidify modifier on top. Now we can duplicate all of that stuff and put it in the right place. Now I'm basically going to do the same thing for the other side. Create the same kind of circular boolean for the other side. With this module done, I also apply solidify modifier to it. And now we are adding a railing at the top of this building. With this, we are done with the primary shapes. Next, I took a photo of windows from textures.com. I arranged these windows as two columns, and this is going to be used as emissive texture on all of the windows in the scene. Now I am adding additional loops to the building to later turn them into windows. I separate the geometry here into more or less equal parts. It's not an exact science, so you shouldn't divide them into absolutely equal parts. Don't forget to extrude them inward to give them that much needed dimensionality. It's not going to look as nice if you simply map windows onto a flat surface. And now it's only a matter of UVing it all into place. Now looking back at how this texture came out, if I were to make a new one, I would probably make it so that it doesn't have any columns, but instead it's just a continuous stream so that it would be much easier for me to UV map it. To save yourself some time, you can UV map only a single floor and duplicate the rest. Once you duplicate, you will of course have the same kind of UV mapping on each floor. But you can use Select Randomize tool in Blender in deselect mode. And this way, whatever is left randomly selected, you can UV map into a new place. Whenever I do UV mapping of windows, I always use projection from view. This is especially useful when you have to UV map flat surfaces. There is really not that much to modeling buildings. The only thing that is tricky is UV mapping of windows because it takes a lot of time. You can see me using UV Toolkit add-on for Blender. It is pretty useful, but it's not entirely necessary to use it. You can still use vanilla Blender. The UV Toolkit just makes it a little bit more convenient for you to UV map. Once it is all UV mapped, we can put the building into Unreal, and we'll have to create our materials now. And if you're asking yourself why my UV mapping looks like this, and how is my material then going to look like, then I'm going to show you my material setup in Unreal. It is simple enough. Let's jump into Unreal. And as an example, I'm going to add this base color texture here. We have to tile the material somehow, so for this we will take texture coordinates node and connect it to UV input of our texture. Now we can control tiling in this node, just like that. But it is not the most convenient way to do that. Here's how to do it better. Take multiply node, because we are going to multiply our existing UVs with a new tiling value. In our case, the tiling value is going to be a simple vector 1, which you can create by pressing one key on your keyboard and then left clicking. Connect it to multiply node and then connect the output of the multiply node into the UV input of our texture. Don't forget to convert our vector1 node into a parameter. Create material instance, and now we can increase or decrease styling in real time without the need to wait for shader compilation. I specifically UV mapped my building like that for future texturing. All of these textures were taken from textures.com. I of course edited all of them and made them grayscale, applied some levels. By the way, here is how to render your UV layout as an image in Blender. Press Export UV layout in UV editor. Place these gradients where you want the dirt to appear on the model. And you can also draw gradients of your own, why not? I'm using gradients here as means of separation of elements, sort of like people do with painting miniatures. If you want to know how to properly texture, I would suggest checking out some skilled miniature artists. Here we come to the metal parts of the building. You will notice that it's going to use a different material, but it is still using the same grayscale mask, but the mask here is going to be used for applying rust. Add a little bit of rust leakage here. And now the building is done. You don't have to detail it a lot because it's so far away from the camera. A little demonstration of how to create a material like that. We will take our input textures, diffuse, normal and mask. We will need texture coordinate node to control the tiling. Now create a multiply node, because we are going to multiply the existing tiling with our new tiling value. Put it into texture UVs, but not into the UVs of our mask texture, because we wanted to retain the same kind of mapping. The base color is a bit too bright, so we're going to darken it with a blend overlay node. Create a vector 3 node. You can do that by pressing 3 on the keyboard and left clicking. And if you are going to connect it just like that, it's going to be very dark. So we are going to control the opacity of this blend overlay layer by creating a lerp. You can create a lerp node by pressing L and left clicking. Connect vector 1 to alpha and convert this node into a parameter. We will call it overlay opacity. We also want to display our mask there. We will need a lerp node for that. Connect the mask into alpha, output of the previous lerp node into A, and create a vector 3 and plug it into B. Also convert it into a parameter, and we will call this parameter dirt color. We will also need an opacity control for our dirt layer, so you can create it with the lerp node as we did previously to control overlay color. We do not have a roughness texture, but we will make roughness out of diffuse. Create a lerp node, and here I plug a blue channel into A and mix it with vector 1 set to 0, which is effectively black. Another vector 1 to alpha, and we will call this one roughness. What this is going to do is it's going to darken the roughness texture here. And that is our material. In a similar fashion, I created a metal material. Here's how to control emissive values on the windows. You create your emissive texture first, and if you plug it straight into emissive input, then it may look something like that, which is too powerful, and you do not need that. So instead you could plug it into lerp and dim it this way by blending with vector 1. That's all for this building. Okay, now for the main building. It went through a lot of changes, and I'm not going to show you a step-by-step process of creation of this building. But instead I'm going to give you the main takeaways. The first thing that you will notice is that I am combining the previous building with this hero building. I'm going to use booleans to cut off the unneeded volume of that building. I am combining them together because I wanted to break the silhouette of the main building, of the hero building, and also, since I already have all of this detail modeled, I thought maybe I could just combine them and save myself some time. I modeled these windows and baked them down to a normal map in order to get interesting reflections on my buildings. You will see that this normal map is being used across multiple buildings in the scene. I went through a couple more iterations which I didn't like. For instance, this one was just looking too blocky. But this one was starting to go into the right direction because of these vertical lines. I really liked how they reacted to light, and they created this nice contrast of light and shadow. So I am simplifying shape further and further. And when in doubt, when your model looks a bit too noisy or your composition is a bit too noisy, then try to simplify it. Okay, so here I'm creating booleans to cut out the windows for the building. I am using solidify modifier on my booleans, and my booleans effectively are just planes and just makes it easier to work with them. I have duplicated the faces of the building, gave them a little bit of offset and mapped windows onto them. Also made an initial detail pass on the building facade, but I wasn't really happy with the results, so I decided to do an overpaint. I streamlined the silhouette of the building, and I also tapered the top part of the building, and I minimized all of the detail on the silhouette, and instead I kept all of the detail inside the silhouette, further simplifying the shape. And now the part that I hated the most, of course, it's UV mapping the windows. And here's how I made gravels for the metal parts of the building. Basically, I created a tileable model with random hard surface detail. I then baked it to a normal map. I usually never bake in Blender because it's pretty inconvenient. And I mostly use Marmoset Toolbag and Substance Designer to bake my normals. Mapping the greebles here, and you can see that I also use ambient occlusion. I am going to mix it in multiply mode with the metal's base color. And now the main building is done. In this part of the tutorial, I will show you how to create a shader that is inspired by the code waterfall from the Matrix. So the first thing that we have to do here is we are going to source our katakana symbols. Any black on white text is going to be enough. Just make sure that you like the font, and that's it. This is the only requirement. I took a screenshot of the symbols. They were black on white, and then I inverted that in Photoshop so they became white on black. And I did that because that way it's going to be easier for me to manipulate the image, and then I'm going to invert them back. We will need to display the grid. To do that, go to View and click Extras. Alternatively, you can use hotkey Ctrl H. Let us set up our grid size. The setting is located under Edit, Preferences, Guides and Slices. We will need 40 frames, so since we have a grid every 10%, we can give it 4 subdivisions. And that will make it so that our grid is 40 cells wide. Now we will need to resize our symbols so that they are of similar size, and also that each one of them fits into a single cell. If it's hard for you to see grid color, you can change it to something more visible like red. Place the symbol into the cell. Use Marquee tool to select whichever is inside the cell. Press Ctrl I to invert the selection and then press Delete to delete whichever is outside of the cell. And repeat the operation for the remaining symbols. Now we have our symbols neatly cut out into squares, and this will allow us to snap them into place. Now you will need to arrange the symbols in a single column, however you like them to be. And this is going to be a basis for our first frame. We want the last symbol in the sequence to be the brightest, So select all of the symbols in the sequences other than the last ones. Select a solid color layer, which is going to use our selection as a mask. Make it black and put it at the top of the stack. Change its opacity to around 50 or 60%. Here's how our layer mask is going to look. In a similar fashion, we are going to create the gradient for our sequences of symbols. We also want the symbols to change over time. Remember that the frames go from left to right. I ended up with a sequence like this. When symbols change, they have to be glowing for a couple of frames. For this, we will create an empty layer and use a soft brush on the symbols that need to glow. Carefully erase edges of the harsh highlights with a soft eraser. And clone it to other places where symbols have to glow. It should now look something like this. Give the last symbols in the sequence some glow. For this we'll use a soft brush. Next, apply Gaussian blur to what we have drawn and adjust it into place. And once again, once this highlight is done, put it into other places where it has to be. In a similar way to glowing, we will introduce random dimming to symbols. It should end up like this. As a final step, we will create a random sequence of symbols that change every frame, and we will overlay them with the existing trailing symbols, and they should also be visible in the blank spaces between the sequences of symbols. The final result of our flipbook texture should look like this. Let's map the texture to our model. Create a plane. Create our material for it. Connect the output of our texture to color. Go to UV mapping view and rotate the UVs if necessary. Now let's cut out a single column. To do that, we will press Ctrl R to add loops to our plane. We have 40 frames, so we will need to add 39 loops. Select and delete unneeded frames. Now we are left with a single frame, but our work is not done yet. Let's edit its origin and return its transformation to 0. Add an array modifier and increase the count to 5. Factor x should be increased to 2 and the rest should be 0. Collapse the modifier stack and edit the UVs. Make it so that they are not visibly repeating. Go to UV editing mode and select the right part of your UV islands. We will need to extend them to the rightmost point. Enable the N panel by pressing N on your keyboard if it's not visible. Under Image, you will see your UV coordinates. Set the X coordinates to 1. That should do it. Export the model and import it to Unreal. Put our model into the Unreal scene and create a material. We will call the material matrix code and open the material up. Change the blend mode to translucent, shading model to unlit, and enable two-sided rendering. Open up our imported texture and make sure that its compression setting is set to alpha. Drag the texture into our material. Connect its output to emissive color input. You will need a time node. Create multiply node and also add a vector 1. Right away, convert the vector 1 node to parameter and call it speed. This will be the speed at which our frames change. Set the speed to 1 for now. Create a flipbook node. Connect the multiply output to animation phase. And connect the UVs output of flipbook node to UVs of our texture. We are now getting some animation displayed there, but it's not yet correct. Create vector 1 node, set it to 1. This will be our number of rows in the texture. We have a single row in the texture. We will need another vector 1 to connect to the number of columns. We have 40 frames, so input 40 here. To scroll the texture, we will need a panner node. Connect its output to UV input of the flipbook node. We will also need texture coordinate node, which we will connect to our panner node. And now we create a vector 2 node to control the scrolling speed. As a reminder, vector 2 is created by holding number 2 on your keyboard and left clicking. X should be set to 0 and Y set to minus 0.04. Save your work to see the results. Let's add tint to our hologram, create a vector 3 node, and change the color from black to blue, or anything else you wish. Convert the node to a parameter and call it color. We will multiply our alpha and color. Connect multiply output to emissive color input. Great, now let's control the strength of our emissive color. To do that, multiply the texture node with a vector 1. We will convert the vector 1 node to parameter and call it opacity. Connect it to opacity input. Create an instance of the material we made and apply it to our model. Now we can control parameters of our material. Create other two material instances, one for red and one for green colors. Duplicate our model twice and apply the other material instances to them. Change the colors of our materials and placement of the models to what you need. I was going for the chromatic aberration look without the need to do that in shader, to keep it simple. Change the opacity of the other two materials. And this is the result. A pretty straightforward shader. I hope that you have found this video to be useful. If you are curious, then this whole project took me about 130 hours to finish. I will see you in the next part of this video, where we are going to cover other interesting topics and techniques. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing. This is going to let other people discover it, and I would appreciate this kind of support from you. I will see you in the next video. Bye!